Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today.
Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from this team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer. If you're interested in learning to support the healing of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma.
And now for our interview. Clementine Morrigan has been writing and publishing for more than 20 years, having written several zines and books. They are also a podcaster, as one half of the podcast Canceled. They're the creator of the popular Trauma-Informed Polyamory workshop, as well as several other workshops. She is a trauma educator, an opposer of cancel culture, a sex educator, a person living with complex PTSD, a sober alcoholic, and a proud dog mom to Clover the dog Morrigan. Please enjoy this conversation between Brad Kammer and Clementine Morrigan.
Welcome to Transforming Trauma, Clementine. So happy to have you on here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I've been waiting for our discussion for a long time. I'm a huge fan of your podcast. I'm not sure how much we've swore on our podcast, but it's called Canceled. And I just really appreciate what you're doing. And I just wanted to say before I ask you to kind of share with us who you are, you know, sometimes in life you meet these people that are like doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing at the right time. And when I've listened to you, I feel like I don't even know you yet, but I just feel like you're one of those people, like just the way that you embody your teaching and your sharing and your perspective. I just really appreciate what you're bringing to the world. I know it's from the outside looking in, it looks like very courageous work. I'm sure you're getting a lot of different messages back, but I just appreciate in a world of all this fragmentation and fear and violence that you're speaking up and using your voice. And I'm just really happy to have you on here with us.
Well, thank you so much. That's very nice of you. So you want me to talk about who I am and what I do and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
So I'm primarily a writer. I've been writing and self-publishing basically my whole life, like since I was a teenager. And now I'm a full-time writer. Before I was doing the work that I am doing now on cancel culture, which is the stuff we're going to be getting into today, I was doing a lot of trauma education work, specifically around like polyamory and trauma, because there's not a lot of resources out there that bring those two things together. I have complex PTSD and basically am one of these people who feels quite grounded through doing a lot of research. So I basically read all the books for therapists and have really psychoeducated myself so that I can have a better understanding of the therapy that I'm doing. And then I've also, I try to take that knowledge and make it more accessible for regular people. I do swear a lot. I talk in a very normal way. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's easier for regular people to understand what I'm saying than it is sometimes for some of these books, which in fairness are written for therapists. But I think that therapy clients would do well to understand what is going on and to have a better literacy and knowledge going into their therapy sessions. So I was doing some of that work already. And then my more recent work is on cancel culture. I have a podcast called Canceled, and it is a critique of cancel culture firmly coming out of the left. So I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist, I'm a queer person, I have very strong leftist values, and a lot of the left is unfortunately full of this culture of infighting, campaigns of harassment, targeting people and dehumanizing them based on accusations that have been made against them. And so me and my co-host Jay on the Canceled podcast, we kind of break all of that down and get into it. And I feel that I bring also my knowledge about trauma and the nervous system and how all of this affects people on that level as well, and how it affects our communities on that level. So that's a bit of what I do.
Great. Wow. So excited. So if there was something you wanted our listeners to get out of it, what might be at the top of your list here?
I mean, I guess if I'm talking to therapists, I really, really think that therapists do need to grapple with what cancel culture is. I think that we are in this weird time where even admitting that cancel culture exists is problematic and can get you into a lot of trouble. We are in a weird time where there are literally therapists canceling each other on the internet publicly and taking part in cancellation campaigns. And I really want therapists to think about what kind of example that's setting for clients and how that impacts like safety and trust in the therapy room. How could a client trust a therapist who is taking part in a public spectacle of dehumanization against someone? You know, even if your heart is in the right place and you think that you're doing this in the name of justice, it's like, look at the actual behaviors, you know? Yeah. So I think really therapists need to grapple with this because it's coming into therapy world in a big way. And also another big piece is that canceled people need therapists. They strongly do. There's a lot of them. They are super traumatized. Being canceled is a type of complex trauma. Like I truly believe, and I think we're going to see more of this. We interviewed a researcher named Dr. Christine Marie on the Canceled podcast, and she did a research project on media humiliation, people who have been humiliated publicly in the media, and cancel culture falls under that in a social media way. And basically in her research, you know, which was a small study, but still it found that people were showing symptoms of complex trauma.
Yeah.
And that does not surprise me. I think lots of people are developing complex trauma from this, and it's a specific kind of trauma because it is ongoing into the future, which is distinct from certain kinds of complex trauma or many kind of complex trauma, which, for example, maybe it happened in your childhood, but now it's over. And a lot of the therapeutic process is about, you know, being able to discern the difference between being safe now and when you weren't safe in the past. But for canceled people, the cancellation extends into the future in a confusing and unknown way because you don't know when and in what context in your life it's going to come up again. And basically, like, I just, you know, in understanding the psychological impact of being canceled, I think, you know, as therapists, you understand that like any major like life stressor, like losing a major relationship, losing your job, having, you know, your reputation impacted in some way, like any of those stressors on their own would be enough to really impact someone, especially someone with prior mental health issues. But, you know, it would impact anyone. Having all of those stressors all at once, you know, losing several of your major relationships and like most of your community, having your employment threatened and maybe losing your employment, having future job prospects threatened, having, you know, your vision for the future and the hopes and dreams that you had for yourself totally go up in smoke, having your reputation disappear. Basically, that's what cancellation is. All of those things are happening at once for people. So cancel people need therapists, and they need basically cancel culture literate therapists who both understand what cancel culture is and how it impacts people, and also who understand that canceling people is wrong. And so I've talked to canceled people who basically, you know, can they trust their therapist on this topic is a huge question. It's an open question, you know, where that kind of idea of like unconditional positive regard that a therapist is supposed to see your humanity is like not necessarily a given for canceled people. That's a long answer, but
so much to unpack. So let's start from the beginning, which is like, you know, in the developmental trauma work that we focus a lot on, the biggest fear for a child is attachment loss. It's death for them if they lose their attachment. And then that turns into relational loss. But even from like a community standpoint, like we're tribal people, you know, at our roots. And so the threat of being excommunicated is the worst threat for a human being, to lose their roots in a community and a family system. And so when you're using this term about cancel culture, you're basically talking about that exact existential fear that people lose their most important connections.
Absolutely. It is ostracization. And not just that, but it is ostracization plus stigmatization. So that not only are you expelled from whatever community that you're in, but you're marked in such a way that going forward, if you attempt to go somewhere else and build a new community, that stigmatization follows you. And so it's like a permanent exile. It's it's like not just this community is kicking you out, but it's basically an attempt at social death. Like it is an attempt to make people unable to establish community and relationships of any kind.
Mhm. Okay, so this brings us to a point that I'm always so passionate about. Like, so many people have experienced complex trauma because of the impact of fear and shame growing up, whether it's within the family system, whether it's in the culture. And yet we're using those same tools to, I'm using quotes here, but to teach people about what they've done is wrong. So we're basically using the same tools that have created trauma to try to heal trauma. Like we're shaming people, we're making them afraid to say anything. Like, I mean, help me unpack this about the way that we're using these exact tools that are creating the trauma in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who is involved with therapy world, I think should know, based on like child development stuff, that these kinds of strategies don't work. You know, if you're trying to teach a child, you know, that a certain behavior is not a good thing for them to be doing, it doesn't help them to shame and humiliate them or to punish them and take away like all the things that they love in their life until they change their behavior. Like that's going to frighten them a lot. And if anything, it's going to drive the behavior underground. Like they're not actually learning why they themselves don't want to do that behavior. They're learning that it's very scary if they do that behavior, so they need to hide it, right? And so one of the other places that I draw from a lot in my work is that I'm an alcoholic and I got sober in 12-step communities. And to me, the striking difference in the way that we do things in 12-step communities and the way that we do things in social justice culture, you know, it was a dissonance that I grappled with for many years, because in 12-step communities, you know, you have people coming in who absolutely have done horrible things, you know, who are caught in patterns of doing horrible things in their life, of treating people in their life really, really badly, you know, doing chaotic substance use and just blowing up their lives and everybody else's lives. And we don't say to those people, hey, we're going to take away all your friends, all your community, possibly your employment, your reputation, and everything that you care about. And we might give those things back to you once you've changed your behavior, right? Because how are they going to change their behavior when you've now taken away everything that they need to do the hard work of actually changing their behavior? Because behavior doesn't just change because you decide that you should change it. It takes a lot of work, right? It often takes, like, you know, depending on what kind of behavior we're talking about. But if we're talking about like, you know, serious patterns of like abusive behavior or very like dysfunctional maladaptive behavior, it's probably going to take some time. And it's definitely going to take support. It's going to take the help of a therapist. It's going to take the help of community. And it also, you know, in a 12-step community, when I showed up there and I was like a sketchy street involved alcoholic who people would like cross the street to get away from because I was very scary and I was yelling all the time. Now people in the 12-step community were like, here, have a coffee. Here's my phone number. You're welcome here. And they treated me with kindness and unconditional positive regard. They didn't define me through these behaviors. In fact, they saw in me my human potential and they believed in that potential, and they demonstrated that through their graciousness and their compassion and their welcoming, you know, and in believing in me. And that's what actually gave me the capacity and this time and the space and the tools to start changing my life, you know, and becoming the person that I am today. So I'm like, we absolutely can take things like abuse and other types of antisocial behavior very seriously while not abusing people and acting antisocial behavior as our means of supposedly addressing it, right? It's not going to get us what we want. It's not actually going to change people. It's actually just scapegoating. It's turning human beings into a symbol for like a larger issue, and feeling like if we exile them, then we get rid of the problem. But like, where's the evidence that this actually works in terms of changing people's behavior in a consistent and ongoing way? Like, I don't see it, right? And as somebody who's transformed my own life and known so many others who have transformed their lives in really substantial ways, I know that like leading with compassion is far more effective.
Okay, so let me throw out a few terms that often get thrown around. So safety, advocacy, radical honesty, allyship, like these are words that often get thrown around. So I can imagine someone listening to you and saying, well, yeah, when you're in the 12-step environment, that makes sense. But when someone has done something that's created lack of safety or isn't advocating from their privileged place for people that are less privileged, being an ally, or aren't speaking truth to power, like help me understand how those terms play into some of the dynamics Because I do believe that people, for the most part, are really coming from a well-intended place, but it ends up often being communicated in ways like we talked about that actually go in the opposite direction. So
Yes. Okay. So there's a few things I guess I'll unpack here. These are
yeah,
big topics. But the first is, what is safety? And as therapists, I think that's a very important question for therapists to be thinking about. In social justice culture, which, as I said, I'll keep repeating that I am a leftist and I do care about the liberation and human dignity of all people.
me too.
But in social justice culture, we have this tendency to use words like harm and a lack of safety, in very vague and broad and unclear ways, right? And as somebody with complex PTSD, I don't think that's very helpful, because a big part of recovering from complex PTSD is discernment about when I'm in danger and when I'm not in danger. Because a fundamental part of the disability that I have is that I think I'm in danger when I'm not.
Mhm.
And also sometimes I don't realize I'm in danger when I am, right?
Exactly.
And so this is a big issue. Like, people with trauma have profound, disproportionate nervous system reactions to things that are not actually unsafe, right? We know this. And so for me, I've written about this, I've talked about it on my podcast, but I think it's an important example. Like, I am a survivor of child abuse. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence and many other horrible things. And later in my late 20s, I was in a very unhappy relationship. It was actually like a dynamic where I was anxious, preoccupied, and my partner was avoidant, classic. And so my needs weren't being met. I'm sure my partner's needs were probably also not being met. And we were not happy. And that relationship really was really hard for me. And when I left it, as is very common for people with an anxious, preoccupied, kind of disorganized style, I had like an extreme emotional response to leaving that relationship. And when I saw my ex-partner, I had a very flooded nervous system response and extreme distress. And so when talking to my friends and communities about this, they suggested to me that I had been in an emotionally abusive relationship, because why would I have such an intensely massive nervous system response, if I really was safe?
Mm-hmm.
And so I really believed that I had been in an emotionally abusive relationship. And I started to tell people that. And then I had a therapist do an intervention with me, which I'm extremely, extremely grateful for. And I think that this is an important role that therapists need to be brave enough to play, because, your clients actually are depending on you to do this, which is that when I explained this to my therapist, that I was perceiving that this relationship had been abusive, she was like, that was an unhappy relationship, not an abusive one. And it is very important for you to be able to discern the difference. And honestly, in social justice culture on the internet, she could be canceled for saying that.
Yeah.
Because that would be perceived as like, not believing a survivor.
Yeah, not
right?
validating. Yeah.
Not validating my own framing. But her actual responsibility as my therapist is not to just validate anything I say, because wow, if you did that, that would not be helpful for me as somebody with PTSD, like I need people to help me discern, not to just validate whatever my nervous system is telling me. And so her saying that was difficult for me to hear at first, but then she helped me unpack it and to actually look at the behaviors in that relationship and to see, actually, yes, it was an unhappy relationship, but there was no like name calling, there was no degradation, there was no humiliation, there were no threats, there was no controlling behavior. So there wasn't actually any abuse going on. It was just a relationship that wasn't meeting my needs. And so what's important there is that like I wasn't unsafe and I could have left at any time. And I needed to connect with my own power and agency to be like, this relationship isn't meeting my needs and I need to leave it, which was difficult for me as somebody with complex childhood trauma. But now that I know that, it's very empowering, because I don't have to stay in a relationship like that anymore. And I don't have to believe that I'm being abused if I'm not being abused. So that's kind of a tangent to say that, like, I think very often there are things that can be triggering for people. And sometimes what those things are can be a range. They can range from something that is actually totally benign, like a disagreement, or it might be something where somebody has said something that's like maybe unintentionally disrespectful, all the way to things that are like actually disrespectful or dehumanizing or not cool in some kind of way, right? But there's like a range, and people can have a very intense nervous system response to anything on that range that feels like you are in danger, that feels like you are being treated in a way that is really unsafe. And that isn't always the case, and I think that especially in social justice culture online, we have this very, very intense situation where people are throwing around words like safety and harm and saying that a space is not safe, when what is actually going on there is normative disagreement and conflict, differences of opinion, and sometimes normal human errors that can be disrespectful, but that's part of human relating, is that people are going to make errors and do things that can be disrespectful sometimes. And if they are informed of that and there's like communication about it, and then they're like, oh, like, whoops, I stepped on your foot, I'm sorry, you should be able to repair and move forward instead of blowing up.
Which is what all the attachment literature says. It's not really about the attachment failures for children. It's about the ability for the parents or the caretakers to really repair. That makes the strength of the relationship and teaches a child that they can have relational conflict, relational distress, and still stay in relationship and in connection.
Exactly. Yeah, rupture and repair. And so like we need to be practicing that, and we don't need to act like every single rupture is this like horrifying, like violent thing. It's actually a normal part of human relating. So there's that. Now I want to just unpack a little bit about the stuff that you're talking about allyship and speaking truth to power and this and that. So this is maybe some of the more controversial part of my work, which is that I challenge something that I call identitarianism. Okay. So identitarianism is distinct from identity politics. Identity politics is just when we are like, you know what, not everybody has the same experience, and different people in different identities experience things differently. And like, we need to care about things like homophobia and racism and so on and so forth, right? Sure. No problem with that. Identitarianism is when we take that a step further and we start to essentialize people based on identity. And we start to act as if there is a coherent, specific ideological viewpoint that people of a particular identity all share. When we see someone's identity as like the most important thing about them and the thing that is most determining of all of their life experiences, more important than other factors, other identities they might have, other experiences they might have, their own personal choices, their beliefs, so on and so forth, And so what it does is it flattens difference, right? And you will get people saying things like, this is the perspective or the belief of fill in the blank community, right? And they will say this about the queer community, the BIPOC community, the trans community, they will say it about any sort of community, but these aren't communities that they're talking about. They're populations. And they are sometimes millions or billions of people inside those populations. Those people don't all think the same thing, right? They don't have a coherent perspective on anything. Even on the left, if you go into any like marginalized identity group and you decide to do like a thorough reading of like what organizers and scholars have been saying over the past 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you will find, in fact, great internal debate and disagreement about the right way to do things, about how we should best be challenging power. It's not a settled question. And so very often I do agree that it's coming from the right place, in the sense that they want to be respectful and they want to challenge, systems of oppression, and they want to make sure that they're uplifting marginalized voices. But sometimes, and actually quite often these days, what they end up doing is kind of reproducing the very thing that we're trying to move away from, because it's dehumanizing and disrespectful to turn any one person into a spokesperson for their identity group.
It's another form of objectification, basically.
Yes, because you are basically erasing all of the perspectives within that identity group that don't agree with the one person here, right? And you're also there's a lot of pressure to put on that person too. Even if they're claiming it for themselves, it's not really fair to ask a person to speak on behalf of an entire population. And we really lose a lot, because whatever type of oppression you want to talk about, whether it's racism, whether it's like homophobia, transphobia, whatever, sexism, misogyny, ableism, if you take these questions seriously, then you understand that they're big, important, nuanced questions that people have to think really deeply about. And unfortunately, there's not like a set, easy answer on how to solve all of this. And it's more like a complicated entering into a huge amount of like debate, dialogue, and grappling, right? There's a lot of grappling going on with these questions. And now we've reached a time where people act as if these questions are settled, and they'll kind of send you like an Instagram like listicle that's like, here's the answer about how to not be a racist or not be transphobic or whatever. But it's like, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. And so a phrase that I like to use with regard to this is outsourcing your integrity. And I think that it's really tricky for people, because they just want to know a simple answer as to how to not be oppressive. And so they're like, look, I got the listicle. This is how you do it. And I'm like, actually, if you spend a bit more time and listen to a lot of thinkers within the identity group that you're claiming to speak for, even on the left, you will find that many of them disagree with your listicle. You know, you will find that there's many of them who actually have a great deal of problems with the way that this listicle is framing things, right? So it's not that simple and it's not that easy. And so I think what ends up happening is that people shut down discussion and internal disagreement by simply saying, like, you know, by using identitarianism and by saying, you can't say this or you can't disagree with this because X community has said so. So I think we actually have to get a little bit braver about challenging this stuff. In terms of my work, I think it's the most controversial thing because I think people really feel stressed out about that, especially if they are not in the identity group that they might be like challenging the listicle on or whatever. But it's actually, to me, if we really do take seriously the idea that we want all people to be treated with human dignity and we want liberation for all people, then we actually have more work ahead of us, which is a bit more complicated than just sort of prepackaged, small, easy answers.
This is so great because this leads me to more of a personal question about the work that we do in the community that we have, because we're a trauma training organization. So we're focused on trauma training. And generally the way that we're doing this is we're training helping professionals, therapists, people that work with people that are dealing with trauma. And the model is really designed to work one-on-one with people. Not that it doesn't have other ways of application, but that's how we train people. And we get a lot of pushback sometimes because the idea of that taking the individual out of the collective is somehow doing some kind of damage. If there's some kind of privilege about just like focusing on the individual, when actually from our perspective, we are holding that the individual is part of the system and that the healing of the individual has tangible impact on changing systems. But we're often getting this pushback about like, oh, when you work with the individual, you're being privileged or you're reductionistic or whatever the language is. And I wonder your thoughts about this individual and collective, because it feels similar to what you were saying about the essentialism and the identitarianism.
Yeah, I mean, we have gotten to a place where we're not allowed to have disagreement. We're not allowed to have different perspectives about the right way to do things, right? It's bizarre because it's like, it's okay if somebody's like, hey, I think that it's not the best to focus on the individual or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as saying, I don't think you guys should do that because I disagree with it, right? It's actually fine for people who are thinking deeply about these questions to come up with different answers to them. And those answers can exist side by side. Like the idea that we need to come to this like final conclusion is very bizarre to me and like very out of touch with reality.
Well, and it seems like that's going against the idea of diversity is that, we work from the individual, but other people get to work from the collective. And we're not going into that
exactly
and saying you should only work from the individual. Like we're just all having different ways of addressing the same systemic issues.
Yeah. And I think we need a diversity of tactics because we do see that like people are not the same as each other. People are not the same as each other. They don't always need the same things. And I don't think that it's about figuring out like the one true right best way of doing things, but it's about trying to see what works and trying different things and building different frameworks and models. And then some people are going to vibe more with one thing and some people are going to vibe more with something else. And that's okay. Right. But to answer your question, I mean, yeah, I personally think that there's a ton of work that people need to do on an individual level. And in my opinion, that has to go side by side with like the work that we're doing, like relationally and in our communities and stuff like that. Like I had a lot of work that I needed to do, with other people, with a therapist, for me, with a sponsor. There was other people involved, obviously, but I needed to do some work. And that's how I was able to show up in my relationships and in my communities in a more responsible way. So for me, that makes sense. And I don't think it has to be either or. I think that like collective and communal stuff and individual stuff are like always like kind of going back and forth into each other. So,
so this piece about, am I using the right word, essentialism or?
Yes, essentialism.
Okay. So help me understand more because it feels very connected to a certain kind of objectification or dehumanization.
Yes. Okay. So essentialism is the idea that there's like an essential truth inside of people. And when we talk about essentialism in the context of identitarianism, it's the idea that there's some kind of like essential shared reality of identity groups, right? That if you are like a woman, for example, there's certain true deep things inside of you. It's almost like metaphysical that like exists that is like essential to you as a woman. And so this is something that I think leftists and people who have challenged various oppressive systems were initially fighting against for a very long time. They were like, it is not fair to take someone's identity and then to think that you know them based on that. Like, you actually have to get to know the person. And if you know people, you know that you could take a whole group of women and you would find that they're quite different from each other. Sure, they might have some things in common with each other, but they're also going to have some things in common with some men. People are different, and them being like a woman is like one aspect of them, and what being a woman means to them or how that has played out in their life is going to be unique, and it's not like an essential thing that it's just knowing that is telling you something very fundamental about them. Right now, unfortunately, in this kind of current wave of social justice culture, we started to become quite essentialist in a way that it's like as if, because the thing is that like sexism and racism and homophobia, those are essentialist ways of thinking, but in a negative way. It's being like there's like these negative essential qualities. But now in social justice culture, we're kind of doing essentialism, and we're like, as long as we say that the essential qualities are positive, then it's fine. But it's not fine. It's not fine to reduce people to their identities. And you have to leave room for diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of experience within any identity group. So that's the way that essentialism plays out with regard to identity. It also plays out in a slightly different way. Like, I use the word in a slightly different way to talk about basically the way that we in social justice culture now discuss what we call harm or abuse, in that we now act as if people who behave in harmful ways or abusive ways do so because they are a certain kind of person. Because they have some kind of essential quality within them that makes them bad, as opposed to a more nuanced, trauma-informed, context-informed situation that is like, okay, it actually makes sense that people behave in all sorts of ways given the context, right? Given the life experience that they've had, given the cultural context of what they have learned in their life, and so on and so forth. So when we take that perspective, we're like, it's not that this person is a bad person, or that there's some kind of essential badness deep within them, but it's that this is what ended up happening due to a combination of their circumstances and their choices. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about it. But I also think that it's important because you will have people say things like, but there's a celebrity right now who was saying some very like dehumanizing and oppressive things on the internet, just on Twitter. And this celebrity also apparently has bipolar disorder. And then people were being like, don't say that this person is doing these things because they have bipolar disorder, because there's lots of people who have bipolar disorder who don't say these things. And so it's acting as if the fact that this person has, bipolar disorder, which does tend to result in like manic episodes where you say and do all sorts of, regrettable things, could have nothing to do with this person saying offensive things, because offensive things are not about your bipolar disorder. It's about some kind of innate badness within you, right? And I'm like, people who are having mental health crises act in ways that are offensive. I don't know what to tell you. Like, alcoholics act in crazy ways. People in mental health crisis act in crazy ways. And sometimes that comes out in ways that is carrying the baggage of a culture that has oppressive ideas in it. And so it makes more sense to me to be like, yes, it's probably a combination of like mental health stuff and also, the cultural baggage that is like full of oppressive ideas and dehumanizing ideas. And then, yes, like, it's not to say the person has no part in it, but it's not just about whether the person is a good or bad person.
So that leads us to this term that you guys use a lot, the Nexus. So I'd love for you to explain the Nexus, because I think you're starting to describe it a little bit.
For sure. So basically, I've been saying social justice culture in this interview, but we basically use the term the Nexus on the Canceled podcast as a way of talking about what people generally call social justice culture, or somebody in a workshop I was doing yesterday called it internet politics, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. It gets called a lot of things, but it doesn't name itself, which is important because it's hard to challenge or criticize something or engage in dialogue with something if it refuses to admit that it is a specific thing, like not just like the inherent truth or the inherent righteousness or whatever, but that it's a specific ideology, right? So the Nexus is the meeting of cancel culture, identitarianism, and social media. That's the way that we define it on the podcast. And it's basically an emergent culture that is what is created when you bring those three things together. And so I've already talked a little bit about what identitarianism is I guess I've talked about cancel culture, but like, to be clear, cancel culture is targeted harassment campaigns against individuals and scapegoating and ostracization, stigmatization that affects their social belonging and their material security. And then social media, which we all, I'm sure, know what that is, it contributes to this way of relating that is very dehumanizing, very disconnected. It completely erodes our attention span. It encourages us to relate in a way that has no attachment based anything, because you're not even looking at the person in front of you. People are reduced to just like information. And also there's this element of like virality on the internet that is like out of control, right? Because it's not like the idea of like dehumanizing people and ostracizing them is new. We've been doing that for a long time. On the left, in social justice like movements, that's been going on for a long time. Not just on the left either, like, you know, all across like human societies and stuff. We've always done this. But the social media component, you know, blows it up so that like regular people now are kind of being treated like celebrities in a way that was never the case before, right? I often say that, like, you know, because the way we treat celebrities is super weird. And I would say that like we kind of have this cultural trade-off with celebrities where we kind of get to just dehumanize them and use their lives as entertainment, like through tabloid stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And the trade-off was that they were really rich, you know, so they got lots of money, and then we dehumanized them for entertainment. But now we do this same kind of celebrityism with just regular people who are not rich. And an important thing to say about cancel culture is that the vast majority of cancel people are not celebrities. And the conversation on cancel culture is always happening about, people will bring up like famous people.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of people who are experiencing these very intense, brutal campaigns are not celebrities. They are definitely not rich. They are just regular working people. And so they don't have the cushion that wealth provides, you know, in terms of like PR people, lawyers, and also just like the material security of wealth. So to be a regular person and to have accusations against you being shared to thousands or hundreds of thousands of people internationally is a completely unprecedented kind of experience that now is happening to more and more people, and is pretty brutal. So yeah, altogether, the Nexus is, it's kind of like a new phenomenon, and it's a specific ideology, like it's a specific way of thinking about things that really is identitarian, that is essentialist, that grounds people's right to speak in their identity positions, that flattens difference between identities, that also overstates harm, that has no tolerance for conflict and disagreement, and that dehumanizes people and exiles them in a very spectacular and over-the-top way.
Wow, great job. That's so fascinating. Okay, so if you're open to this next question, if you're not, that's fine. We'll go in a different direction. But you know, you clearly have a lot of passion for this, and I was listening to you talk about the cancel culture happening to normal people.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you might have been impacted by this. And
oh yes, of course.
so yes, as much as you're willing to share about your story and like what brought you to feel the passion and courage to speak up about all this.
Yeah. So basically, I'll give you some background. Like, I first came into the Nexus or social justice culture very young, because I had abuse in my childhood home and I was a young queer person, and I came out of the closet when I was 14, and I ended up dropping out of high school, and I moved to Toronto, and I went to a queer alternative school. And this was like in 2003. And so back then there was the beginnings of this culture, and it was still like relatively fringe and relatively new, but because I was in a queer alternative school, I definitely got it. And we did things like stand in a line, and they would be like, if you're white, take a step forward. You know, if you have a disability, take a step back. And like, this was like a way of conceptualizing power that has now become, you know, incredibly common and much more mainstream than it was back then. And so as somebody, like, the intersection between this culture and complex PTSD is really interesting, because basically I remember even as early as back then when I was a teenager and first entering into this culture, that it really contributed to a feeling of hypervigilance within my social life, because I was encouraged to be constantly on guard that I might do something or say something wrong and get into a lot of trouble, right? And so I was constantly feeling anxious and worried about that. And I was also encouraged to like be monitoring and surveying the behavior of my friends, so in case they did any missteps, right? So this is not a great environment for like a young person to be developing relationships, especially a young person with trauma. But I was only in that world for a few years, and then my life took a turn because I'm an alcoholic. And basically I say, like, I got drunk for a decade. I disappeared. I was a street involved alcoholic for a decade. And then when I got sober, when I was 25, I basically like reemerged out of this blur of like a cycle of trauma and chaotic substance use. And I landed basically right back in the Nexus, because as a queer person, as a leftist, as soon as I sort of started to do my thing again, that's where I was. And what I noticed was that things had really advanced in the 10 years that I was gone. This culture had become way more mainstream, way more like everybody was doing it now. And it's become even more in the 10 years since then. So I had this profound amount of fear and shame in me about the fact that I knew that I had been a street-involved alcoholic who had done all sorts of things that would definitely get me canceled if anybody knew about them.
Yeah.
You know, and I had to live this life that I felt like I was building my life on a foundation that like could be pulled out from underneath me at any time. Because I was like, in this culture, I see that people are defined by their mistakes. They're never allowed to live them down. People have tweets that they did like sometimes when they were like 12 resurface and have their lives destroyed. So I'm like, what are people going to say when they find out about me? In the 10 years I spent being completely insane, I didn't see any compassion for that. So I was living in a lot of fear. And so I dealt with that by basically becoming like hypervigilantly obsessed with social justice culture. I learned all the rules. I studied it carefully, you know, and part of it was that, you know, I did really want to be good. I wanted to be good, but it's like the line between, you know, acting from a place of integrity and being like, I want to act in a way that is respectful and honors the human dignity of all people, and the trauma-based behavior of, I don't want to get in trouble, you know, is like, that's a fine line. And I think it gets blurred for a lot of people. And at one point during those years when I was very, very deep in it and just like having panic attacks, like posting things online and having panic attacks, you know, making sure that every time there was like some political thing going on, I always made the exact right posts, said all the exact right things, and then just feeling so anxious that I didn't say it in the exact right way, you know, it was very deeply affecting my mental health. And one day I had this realization where it just came to me, this line, which was, being good will never solve the problem, because the problem is not that I am bad. And I realized that this was a reenactment in so many ways of my dysfunctional childhood, of constantly being like, will I be loved? Will I be safe? Will I be included? If I can just demonstrate that I'm good, you know, can I just avoid getting into trouble here, you know? And so the combination of being in 12-step programs and being in therapy, by the time I was 5 years sober, I was really reaching a critical point of dissonance between everything that I was learning in therapy and 12-step world, which was, you know, have compassion for people, be generous and kind and forgiving. Also, like, have good boundaries, know what's yours and what's not yours, you know, not being like codependent and taking responsibility for somebody else's emotional reaction and being like, this is my side of the street, this is your side of the street. I was becoming basically emotionally sober and healthy and like grounded. And then I was acting in these ways in social justice culture that were completely out of alignment with that. You know, I was treating people like they were disposable. I was apologizing for things that I shouldn't be apologizing for, having really poor boundaries. So I was starting to deprogram is basically what we call it on the podcast. Like I was deprogramming from this way of thinking, and I was allowing, at least internally, a level of freedom for myself to think for myself. And there was a few close relationships where I was, you know, brave enough to start having these dissenting conversations. But then, you know, I had the whole fact that I was a public figure and a writer and that was my career. So I was like, I don't want to be canceled. So I was very hesitant to be honest about these things publicly. But the thing is that I had deprogrammed enough that I wasn't really playing along in the same way. I wasn't hypervigilantly following the rules. I wasn't making this like very intense post every time something political happened. You know, I was just sort of living in my integrity and living my life. And so in 2020, I got canceled. And it was very absurd because for the amount that I was so afraid that someone would dig up my sketchy past and cancel me for that, in fact, I was accused of not sharing about a political issue that I had actually shared about. And then I was like, I have shared about this. And then it was demanded that I deplatform. And it was literally, that's it. Like nothing happened beyond that. And I lost almost all my friends. I had to move. Basically, almost everyone I had known in my life from all chapters of my life, like either quietly unfollowed me and disappeared or joined in the pylons of everybody talking about how I'm a horrible person. And it was absolutely my worst fear and really just as bad, if not worse, than I could have possibly imagined. I lost a lot. It was very intense. But the thing is that I was way too therapied at this point to believe that it was my fault or to believe that like there was some way I could manage it. I just understood that this is other people's inappropriate behavior that's going on right now. It has nothing to do with me. I absolutely know how to check my integrity to see if I've acted in a way that's outside of it. You know, I got 12 steps for that. I have a whole framework for like looking at my behavior and I didn't do anything wrong. So I was like, I can't actually apologize for somebody else like having a meltdown and projecting onto me their own shit, you know? And so, yeah, my life blew up and I decided to live in reality and to live in my integrity. And I started to openly talk about cancel culture. We made the podcast and now I've become an outspoken critic of it because I was like, well, I'm canceled anyway. So there's no point in trying to avoid that anymore. So I'm just going to be honest. And the result has been amazing because now, I mean, like, you know, this is a therapy podcast. I think this is a really important like takeaway from this for me is that for so many years in therapy, I was dealing with my disorganized attachment and my complex PTSD and my deep inability to trust my friends and to feel safe with my friends, you know? And I was like, wow, I have so much complex PTSD and I can't trust my friends. And then I got canceled and all my friends abandoned me all at once. So one of the things that I took away from that is I was like, it wasn't just my complex PTSD. My friends were not trustworthy. The relationships that I was investing in were not solid relationships because I was in a culture that normalized disposability, you know, and I had witnessed this happen to other people. So how was I supposed to feel safe, right? How was I supposed to truly trust my friends when I was seeing modeled all around me all the time that one wrong move or one accusation, you know, can result in full and total exile? And so now I actually build my relationships from this place of these values where I openly am like, I reject this stuff. I reject dehumanization. I reject defining people by their mistakes. I reject, you know, believing accusations without getting more information. And so now I've been able to rebuild my community in a way that is like actually secure. And I'm like, oh, wow, secure attachment, because I can have friends now that I can disagree with, you know, and we don't have to agree with each other in order to be friends. And I can have conflict and not worry that the friends in my life are going to put that conflict on the internet and like publicly attack me because we have built our friendships from a shared place, like shared values of not believing in treating each other this way. So it's actually very amazing. And in many ways, I like recommend it to people. I'm like, being canceled sucks, but maybe pre-canceling yourself is a good idea, you know?
Well, but the deeper message that I'm hearing is really your internal work. I mean, you know, looking for safety or trust outside is part of this whole unresolved complex trauma, and, you know, needing to feel okay if other people hold you as okay. That statement you said was so powerful, but really determining that the safety is really internally driven and the trust is internally driven. And even when we are getting into environments where there is potential real danger, we can listen to ourselves, trust ourselves, and do the best we can to make choices to try to take care of ourselves, as opposed to projecting that everyone else needs to change for us to be okay.
Yes. Yes. And it's also like, you know, if you live your life from that place and you start modeling that, what ends up happening is you start meeting more people who are also doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so you start to enter into more relationships with more people who are being responsible for themselves and who are acting from a place of integrity. And that obviously leads to stronger and more secure relationships and relating. So overall, very good. And definitely a bumpy road though, you know, definitely a really bumpy road to get here. But I definitely wouldn't go back to my prior life of basically, like you were saying, like thinking that I could be safe by managing other people's reactions to me, you know, and by trying to act in a way that was going to prevent people from getting mad at me. Now I'm like, you know what? If you are honest and you have healthy boundaries and you are differentiated and you know where, you know, you end and someone else begins, people are going to be mad at you.
Yeah.
Literally, definitely,
Yeah.
you know? They're going to be mad. There's all sorts of people who are going to be mad about that. And that's okay. Like, it's not your job to make them not mad about it. You know, they can be mad about it and you can still maintain your boundaries and be your own person and disagree. And, you know, sometimes there's the ability for like healthy conflict and repair there. And sometimes there's not. And you just have to maintain your boundaries.
Yeah. My mentor has this great saying, in a world of bent over people, the one standing upright looks strange. And,
Yes.
you know, sometimes it does. It's like we feel all that pressure to bend ourselves over. But what I hear you doing, which is an inspiration, is just really staying in your integrity. And when you stay in your integrity, you will be attacked. I mean, that is what's going to happen. And if the security and trust and safety is internally driven, you'll be able to hold that and tolerate that and learn from it and grow from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just as we're starting to wrap up here, you know, for an organization like ours or any organization that really has this mission to do good in the world, I mean, we're a trauma healing organization. We have, I think, the best of intentions, and we're not perfect by any means. But What's your feedback for us, or some tips maybe, or whatever, about how do we hold this balance between, wanting to support people's unique experiences and also maintaining our integrity of our mission? Because I think this is the tension point. It's like people want to take us in other directions sometimes, and we don't want to invalidate their experience, but we only can do what we can do, and we have a certain mission to it. And so what are some ideas about how we can balance both?
I mean, I think basically what we were just talking about on the individual level needs to happen on the organizational level, right? Which is that discernment and that differentiation between, this is us, this is our organization, these are our internal values, this is our mission, this is what our purpose is, and that being the case does not mean that somebody else's perspectives, what they want to focus on, is wrong or bad. But not everything is going to be about everything. Not everything can be, right? Like, it's okay to be like, this is actually what our organization wants to do. And I think that there's a way of listening to feedback that is like, like, if there is not an option to carefully consider feedback and reject it, then it's not feedback. It's a demand, right? That's not healthy relating. It's not healthy relating on an interpersonal level, and it's not healthy relating on the level of organizations either, right? We have to be allowed to say no. And that is difficult for people to hear, I think. It's actually modeling this kind of integrity that we're talking about. We have to be able to listen to feedback and be like, wow, that's very interesting. We thought about it carefully. And also, it doesn't fit with what we are doing. It doesn't actually fit with our model and our vision and our values and what we're trying to do. Doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad. Doesn't mean that nobody should do it, but it just doesn't fit for us, And I think a huge part of this is, especially for organizations and stuff, is managing the nervous system reaction of being we're going to be misunderstood. We're going to be misrepresented, and it's one of the big stressors of cancel culture is this idea of desperately wanting people to see us for who we are, right? It feels very bad to be misrepresented. And unfortunately in this culture, people will misrepresent you, especially if you say no to them. If you say, we've listened to your feedback and actually this is not the direction we're going to go in, people are going to frame that as, well, now you're bad and you're wrong and you're doing horrible harm, and that may not be the case, and I think you have to trust yourselves, individually and then as a group, to be able to carefully look at feedback and decide what makes sense and what doesn't. And if it doesn't, that's not causing harm. That's just simply having boundaries and deciding what works for you and for your organization. And then it's do you have the capacity to tolerate being misunderstood and even sometimes willfully misrepresented? And I think that, especially when it's your work and you believe in your work deeply, it can feel basically intolerable to do that, because you're well, being misrepresented is going to undermine our ability to do our work, right? And the work is so important that maybe it's better to sort of bend or to make compromises that we don't actually believe in order to try to save the reputation of the work. But I think that that's a bad idea. I think it is better to be in honesty and clarity and integrity and be misrepresented, because the thing is that it's modeling a new way of relating. And especially for therapists, I think we need to model this. We need to model that it is okay for people to be mad at us. It's okay for people to misunderstand us. It's even okay when people are misrepresenting us. It feels very bad, but we can represent ourselves by living in our integrity and modeling that, And so I think a big part of this is starting to be brave enough to have these conversations. And I think therapists are such an interesting place for this to be happening, because it's all of that knowledge from interpersonal relating that therapists have can be applied to this stuff very clearly, Boundaries and differentiation is so fundamental. And that's basically what this comes down to.
Yeah, there's a concept, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this. It's called Roru and Woru. You ever heard of that?
No.
It's from psychodynamic James Masterson's work. He talks about being a rewarding object versus being a rejecting object. The W stands for withdrawing object. So basically, it's a lot of therapists so much want to be the rewarding object. In NARM, we call it unmanaged empathy. It's we always want to be the caretaker. We want to be the one that's a safe space. And we're very afraid of being represented as the withdrawing or rejecting object. So that makes therapists sometimes not speak truth. Your therapist spoke truth without worrying about how you would react to it. And so we reject both sides of it. We don't want to be the rewarding object. We don't want to be the withdrawing or rejecting object. We just want to do the best we can to speak in reality and speak speak truth, and developing a greater tolerance and capacity to manage the distress that exists to be an adult in a very complex world.
Yes, it's so fundamental. And I think for me, like in my own trauma journey, like in childhood trauma, the whole thing is that you're not allowed to be in reality. You're not allowed to be in reality, right?
Yes.
And so now being in reality is the most important thing for me. Like I literally cannot afford not to be in reality, right?
Yeah.
I cannot go along with things that are just not true, right? And people can project all of this stuff onto me, and I'm like, that's your stuff, cool, like that's for you to work with, but I know what's mine, and I have to be able to hold that and be in that regardless of people getting super, super mad at me about it. So it's definitely, I think a lot of it is really practicing the skills of distress tolerance of like, and it gets easier, it gets easier with time. At first, it's very, very stressful for people to misrepresent you. After being misrepresented consistently for years, I can say that it does get easier. And also you start to see that lots of people see what you're doing. Like there's those who are misrepresenting, but then there's others who are seeing you stand up in courage, in integrity, differentiated, being like, no, I'm just trying to stay in reality here. I'm just having a disagreement. And there's people who, especially in this climate, really appreciate that modeling because it's severely lacking. And most people do just bend and fold under this pressure. So we need more of it.
Well, and you really are an incredible model. And I've shared your podcast with a lot of different people recently. And I think the ideas that you're sharing here are so important just generally, but also just the way you embody them. I'm really drawn to that and appreciate you for all the work you've done. And I know this hasn't been easy for you, and not just the last couple of years, but just, from what you came out of through your childhood and how you've made this life for yourself. And these are the folks we like to talk to here on the podcast because you're real, you're genuine. And I really hope we can have more conversations because I think there's a lot to learn from what you're sharing.
Absolutely. I'm totally honored to be able to be having this conversation in this context because I think therapists really need to start having these conversations. So I'm grateful to be here on the pod. Thank you.
Yeah. And maybe sometime we can bring you in and actually have more of a dialogue with some of our community too. That would be really fun.
Yeah, totally.
So how can folks learn more about you and see what you're doing out in the world?
Totally. So I'm very active on Instagram. So my Instagram is just Clementine Morrigan. You can find lots of bite-sized snippets on there. The podcast is Canceled, which you can find most places that you listen to podcasts just by searching Canceled. We also have a Patreon for the Canceled, which is patreon.com/canceled. And I have a website, clementinemorrigan.com, where people can buy like my books and my zines and my writing. And I have a Substack, though I don't update it super often, but it's clementinemorrigan.substack.com for various articles, some related to the stuff that I was talking about today.
Okay, last question, maybe not a quick one, but where do you see yourself going from here? What's your vision for yourself moving forward?
I feel like I have many visions for myself moving forward, but we definitely want to write a book about everything that we've just been talking about. We want to write a book about the canceled, the frameworks that we're putting out on the podcast. So that is a long-term goal that we're like trying to figure out what to do because we want to get a publisher for it. Another thing that I'm doing is doing this exact work, but with leftist organizations. And I'm doing that for free, but I'm just basically meeting with leftist orgs who are trying not to blow up. And that's my contribution to the climate change situation, because I'm like, we need activists and organizers to be able to do their work. And so if I can help, prevent them from blowing themselves up, that would be really great. So I'm feeling good about that. And then otherwise, I don't know, like, I feel like I'm kind of living my dream right now. I'm like doing work that feels meaningful and important. And there's been a lot of challenges, but I'm successfully able to do it. So I kind of just want to keep doing that, keep publishing, keep writing, and see where it goes.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to be following you every step of the way. So thanks so much for being on our podcast here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.